What then does kingdom mean? We should think of kingdom, Basileia, as meaning God's kingly rule. We shouldn't think of the kingdom as a piece of territory, like the United Kingdom from which I come. We shouldn't think of it as a thing or an object. The kingdom is a personal presence, an immediate personal relationship. Then the kingdom is something already present with us here and now. Luke 17:21, the kingdom of heaven is within you. Or it could be translated, the kingdom of heaven is among you. But whichever version we adopt, the kingdom is seen as something present. But though it is already present, it only comes to its full fulfillment and revelation in the future, at the second coming, at the last day. So the kingdom in its fullness signifies the age to come. If we start the liturgy then with the words, "Blessed is the kingdom," what we are doing is to affirm that the liturgy is a journey. This is an idea Father Alexander develops in what I think is his best book, For the Life of the World, also published under the title Orthodoxy and Sacraments, also published in England under the title The World as Sacrament. Nevertheless, these are not three books but one. So Father Alexander there sees the liturgy as a journey from the here and now into the age to come. Every Eucharist is a Passover meal. We pass over from the present age into the age to come. At every Eucharist, the kingdom of God comes with power. Every Eucharist is an eschatological event. The eschaton, the end, breaks into this present life. The prayer, "Thy kingdom come," will be fulfilled in its totality at the second coming. But it is also fulfilled at each celebration of the divine liturgy. Every Eucharist is the messianic banquet of the Lamb. At every Eucharist, eternal life begins. So St. Ignatius of Antioch says of the communion that it is the medicine of immortality, the antidote whereby we do not die, but live forever in Christ. And St. Isaac the Syrian says, "Blessed is the one who eats from the bread of love, which is Jesus. While still in this world, he breathes the air of the resurrection, which the righteous will enjoy after they arise from the dead." That is the atmosphere we are breathing in the divine liturgy, the air of the resurrection. So every time we begin with "Blessed is the kingdom," we are to feel the presence of the kingdom, the age to come. We are to feel with sobriety and yet with personal immediacy the great joy of the kingdom. There then are three phrases which, as I say, set the tone for what is to follow. We are to think of the unity of the earthly and the heavenly altar. And that's fundamental for our understanding of the liturgy as a sacrifice. And I'll come back to that this afternoon. We are to think of Christ as the one who acts, Christ as the celebrant. And that's likewise fundamental for our understanding of Eucharistic presence and sacrifice. And we are to think of the feast of the kingdom. We are entering, each time we celebrate the liturgy, by anticipation, into the age to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Grace. Questions and comments? Father Michael Shanbor.
Your Grace, during the Keron prayers of preparation, the priest prays that I may perform this sacred and bloodless worship. At least that's a translation of the Liturgicon. I was wondering if you know what the Greek is for perform, and obviously that can have various connotations. The way we use that word in modern times, it's obviously not a performance, but it makes it sound like something we're doing, and we are obviously lending our hands. But is there any insight that you have into that word? Perform?
I'm afraid I don't recall the particular word at that point. Does anyone have the Greek text?
On the search on it.
Ah.
I think it's peace.
It was, yes, here we are. This is an edition of the liturgy I've never seen before. A very unusual liturgy. It changes to Slavonic in the middle, but I think it's two books bound together. Yes, yes. Oh, I know why I've not seen this edition before. Fancy bringing this here. It says, this book, this holy book, was printed in Rome at the printing press of the Vatican with the blessing of our most blessed Father, the Pope of Rome. Anyway, the text is accurate. And what the priest says is, Hina akatekritos parastasto foverosu vimati tinen emakton irurgian epiteleso. So in order that, standing without condemnation before thy dread judgment seat, I may epiteleso the bloodless hierurgy. It's not so easy to translate. So what is going to be carried out is the bloodless hierurgia, sacred action. And so you could say the service, but hierurgia has a stronger sense than just a service. That's akoulouthia. And emakton, bloodless, that's without shedding of blood. But epiteleso is the verb, and that means celebrate, I think, would be quite a good translation. The liturgy is not so much a performance, it is a celebration. And clearly there it is said, as you mentioned, Father Michael, that it is the priest who is going to celebrate the hierurgy without shedding of blood. And on one level, of course, the liturgy is indeed the action of the priest. The earthly liturgy would not take place if the priest did not perform the service, but it is not only the priests and it is not primarily the priests.
I think I misled you. Because actually in the prayer, in the Liturgicon, it says, fulfill, that I may fulfill the sacred and bloodless service. But then in the priest prayer prior to the great entrance, it does say perform.
Yes.
I don't know if it's the same.
I think both words could be justified. Fulfill, epitelesso, that is a perfectly legitimate translation. I think that perhaps celebrate is a little closer to the Greek, because teleti as a noun in Greek means a celebratory act. But perform would not necessarily have to be understood in the sense of a performance, meaning something that we do showing off to others. Obviously, that perform can be understood in a perfectly neutral sense, meaning carry out. So the action is indeed ours. The priest celebrates, and we can call the priest the celebrant. But what I was suggesting was we always look beyond the visible priest in the earthly liturgy to the invisible priest in the heavenly liturgy. Thank you, Father. Yes. And thank you for the book.
Others? Father Paul Hodge?
Grace, could you comment briefly about our custom of reserving space in the church building as sacred or holy space, as a working out of what you've said in the lecture today? It's often that some of the less enlightened of the faithful perhaps treat the entire space with equanimity, that the narthex or vestibule is equally is treated with the same reverence or irreverence as the space around the altar. And how would it be that we could communicate to the faithful some of these things as far as their propriety of behavior and decorum in the church building itself?
Yes. As you have hinted or pointed out, there are graduations in sacred space. From one point of view, all space is sacred. Heaven and earth are full of thy glory. The divine presence is everywhere. The gate of heaven is everywhere. So there is no spot on earth that is not sacred, because God is present in every place. And that means that an attitude of reverence before the divine presence should be something that we always show. But then it's also true that certain areas in space are set apart, dedicated to God, consecrated. And it's worth reading with care the service of the consecration of a church, but it has an immensely rich theological meaning when a particular building is set apart for the use of God. But within the church building, there are, of course, graduations. The whole church is sacred, but there is a difference between the narthex, the body of the church, and the sanctuary. Just as within the Jewish temple, there was a difference between the outer court, the inner court, and the Holy of Holies. That's another very rich theme to relate the liturgy to the Jewish worship in the temple. I shan't be doing that this weekend, but it's well worth exploring. Now, it's important that our churches should, if possible, have this distinction, that we should have a narthex of some kind in the church, then the body of the church, and that the sanctuary shouldn't just be a little bit of the building at the end, but that it should be in some way architecturally distinct, as is very much the case in Byzantine churches. When I was in Milwaukee recently, I went to the Greek Church of the Annunciation designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, a very remarkable building, as a piece of architecture, very impressive, a great cosmic egg. But totally unsuitable for Orthodox worship, because it's designed in this shape of an egg. There is no real narthex and no real sanctuary, and therefore no proper articulation of sacred space. So I think even if our churches are not literal copies of Byzantine churches, we need always to have this graduation. And of course, the narthex is important liturgically. There are certain actions which are appointed to take place in the narthex, and there needs to be a sense of movement. For example, in the service of baptism, the initiation should be reflected in the use of space. So there are graduations in sacred space, and the narthex is already part of the church, but there is a further step forward when you enter the nave, and a further step forward when you enter the sanctuary. What can we do to bring about a better sense of the holiness of the sanctuary? The first step is that we, the clergy, should be very watchful how we behave in the sanctuary. When I first became Orthodox, I wasn't a server. It was several years before I ever went inside the sanctuary of an Orthodox church. And it wasn't an Antiochene church, I say. It was a little surprising to me, and I was a little shocked. Inside the sanctuary, the other side of the icon screen, beautiful icons in front, but behind in the sanctuary, attached to the icon screen, there were various pegs in which people had hung up their hats and coats. And there were armchairs, such as you would find in a drawing room. And I found that it was a solid icon screen, that the clergy chatted quite happily together throughout the service, except when they were, as it were, on stage doing something in sight of the people. And I'm afraid the icon screen has had a very negative effect in some parts of the Orthodox Church on the behavior of the clergy. So we, the clergy, have to start by showing an example of reverence when we are in the sanctuary.
Father George?
Yeah, in continuation with the question about the narthex and the church, when we come to sense in the great sensing your grace, either one, if you could answer us. I have seen both practices in our archdiocese. One is to go out to the narthex if there are icons, and to sense the narthex too. Is that supposed to be done in the sensing, great sensing?
It is possible that there are different customs, and we have to allow for this, not to say that the particular way we have been taught is the only way. And it's also true, of course, that at different moments, the sensings are different. They vary in their thoroughness and extent. Certainly, in my experience in the monastery at Patmos, to which I belong, and in the monasteries on Mount Athos, at Vespers and at orthros, where the censing of the church is appointed, the celebrant goes right out into the narthex, and he censes the narthex as well as the nave. That, I think, is certainly the rule for the censings outside the liturgy. But during the liturgy, if there is a censing of the church, if there is not matins before the liturgy, but only the reading of the hours, the deacon, or if there isn't a deacon, the priest, is supposed to come out and cense the whole church. In my experience, sometimes the priest doesn't go out into the narthex at that point. But I would be in favor of his doing so then, even before the liturgy. So the narthex is part of the liturgical space and is included in the censings.
I don't remember the description in the liturgicon for the great censing, but I think we go into the narthex, because we certainly do. As there are many people who spend their time in the narthex, they're never in the nave. People who are under penance. I don't mean people who are there because they're lazy or, doing something else. I mean really people who are under penance who remain in the narthex, or those who are doing their own liturgy at the Bengadi. The man who takes care of the candles and the memorial wheat and the prospheta, whatever it is that happens to be in the backs. At the cathedral, we do. We go there. We even go into the baptistry and cense the icons in the baptistry. That's number one. Number two, and this is relating to Father Paul Hodges' question about why is it that some people treat the holy place like the narthex, or how can we change that? I'm in favor, like most Americans, of finding a common denominator. They want everything to be the same. But I don't know why we always have to go to the lowest common denominator. If we want to treat everything the same, I would rather them treat the narthex like the yero, rather than treating the yero like the narthex. So there's nothing wrong with treating everything the same. If that's what the people want to do, that's fine. You make a prostration when you come into the narthex, then, just like we do when we go into the yero. Other questions, comments? I have a question. Your Grace, in the terminology, I don't want to say the tradition, but in the terminology of the Church of Antioch, the service upon entry into the church for the liturgy by the priests and the deacons and the bishops is called the keron. I looked in that book I don't know where it was from, but I looked in there. It had no title. It was just included as part of the prothesis, I believe. I wonder in the Slavonic or in the Greek if that has the name Nikeron, or if that's something that's peculiar to the Church of Antioch that's called the Keron.
In the Greek use, we definitely talk about taking the keros. And that would mean, for example, in the case of the priest and deacon in the monastery, during matins, during the 6th ode of the canon, and remember, if you sing the canon in full, that's going to take about 40 minutes. So you've got more time than would be the case in a parish. In the 6th ode of the canon, the deacon and the priest would say, now it is time to go and take the keros. So we use that phrase, which means to go out into the body of the church, and first of all, to make a threefold bow before the bishop's throne, even if there's no bishop there, and then stand in the center and say the prayers of preparation, ending with the prayer that Father Michael quoted about celebrating the hierurgy without shedding of blood, and of course kissing the icons. So that is called specifically the keros in the Greek use. And the same would apply if you have a bishop at the throne. He would come out during the singing of the praises and would take the keros, say the prayers, kiss the icons, and then, unless he's going to be vested in the middle of the church, he would go into the sanctuary. So we certainly use that word for keros. We use it, and presumably that's where you have taken it from. I'm not sure what the Russians say.
Just looking at the Greek, the first word in the service book is keru epistantos liturgise.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's probably a good answer to our question, because here is the rubric: when the keros, the time, has arrived for celebrating the liturgy, the priest and the deacon, if there is a bishop present, take keros from him. You bow to the bishop's throne if there's no bishop there, but if he's actually there, you go up and kiss his hand. Yes, if there isn't a bishop there, they make a metania in front of the throne. Then they come and stand in front of the holy doors, which are closed, and they make 3 bows, and then the deacon says, give the blessing, Master, and the priest says, blessed is our God, and so they continue. So I think this is, yes, exactly right, that keros means the moment to begin the service. And so you take the keros, meaning you start preparing.
Seize the moment.
Seize the moment.
The question.
Father Timothy?
Grace, I was reading the preface to Bishop John Zizioulis's recently published book, Eucharist, Bishop, and Church, I believe is what it's called. And he points out in his preface that he believes the church is in crisis and is in the temptation of reverting to what he called Presbyterianism, in which he said that the place of the bishop in the local parish is kind of almost, even to the point where in some churches the bishop of the diocese is not even commemorated. That's his quote. I'm not saying anything about our archdiocese. But I was wondering, and what struck me was your comment about going to take Keiron and bowing to the bishop's throne, even though the bishop is not there. And I know that in many of our parishes do not have bishop's thrones. And I'm wondering if our architecture and the way that the temple is appointed is supposed to reflect our theology. I'd be interested in your comment as to whether or not this would be an important thing for a local parish to have a place in which it is, as it were, a place of the icon of the bishop, even though he is not physically present there, to continually preserve our connectedness to our bishop and he being the true pastor of the church. Could you make a comment about that?
First, about bishops' thrones, there is clearly a difference in practice in various parts of the Orthodox Church. In Greek churches, in my experience, even in very small, simple parish churches, there is almost invariably a bishop's throne on the right-hand side as you're looking towards the icon screen, close to where there would be a desk for the chanters. And that throne has a liturgical function even if the bishop isn't there. When you are sensing from the holy doors during the service, having sensed the sanctuary, as you come out, you sense the bishop's throne 3 times before you sense the icons. But in the Russian tradition, there is usually no bishop's throne in the body of the church. The place where the bishop's throne is in the sanctuary, in the circle of the apse. at the center, which, of course, would also be the case in Greek churches. There would be a throne for the bishop there as well. And that is where the bishop had his throne, particularly in the early church. And the Russians, in particular, go up to the throne, if the bishop is celebrating, at the end of the singing of the Trisagion. And he blesses the people from there and sits there during the reading of the epistle. And he stands there during the reading of the gospel in the Russian use. The deacon would stand in the center of the church facing towards the sanctuary as he reads the gospel. But the Russians don't have any throne in the body of the church. They just have a raised platform on which they put an eagle. So there is clearly a difference of practice here in different parts of the Orthodox Church. I'm very surprised by what Metropolitan John says about the bishop not being commemorated, because I've certainly never in my life attended a divine liturgy at which the bishop was not commemorated. However, though the bishop is commemorated, that doesn't necessarily tell you very much about the attitude of the local congregation towards the bishop. And I remember when I was a student, there was a dispute in the Church of England about the bishops, whether the bishop is of the essay of the church, whether he is essential, or whether he is merely of the bene essay, whether it is useful and helpful to have bishops, but you don't necessarily have to have them, which some Anglicans would consider the bishops. Yes, we have bishops in the Anglican Church, but they're not essential. And the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishop Fisher, said, in my view, very truly, he could think of many arguments for holding that bishops were essential. He could not think of any arguments for holding that they were an advantage. But in general, in general, it is very significant in the Orthodox liturgy that the place of the bishop is emphasized. The bishop is the liturgical celebrant of the diocese. We have lost sight of this, and this is a point that Metropolitan John makes very clearly. Until the 4th century, the normal celebrant at the Sunday Eucharist was the bishop. And the priest would only on very rare occasions celebrate. And if the priest does celebrate without the bishop, he is always doing so as the bishop's delegate, as his representative. So the norm is the bishop's liturgy. That we shouldn't regard the episcopal liturgy as being a priestly liturgy with a few extra ceremonies. On the contrary, the basis for the liturgy is what happens when there is a bishop, because the bishop is the basic celebrant in the diocese, and when the priests celebrate, they are celebrating not in their own right, but as representatives of the bishop. Hence, the mention of the bishop a number of times in the liturgy, during the litanies, at the great entrance, if commemorations are made there. Hence also the fact that you cannot celebrate the liturgy without an antiminsion bearing the bishop's signature. So the fact that the priest is acting in the bishop's name is very clearly emphasized. It's interesting if you look at the apostolic tradition of Hippolytus, dating from the early 3rd century, how he describes the respective roles of the bishop and the presbyter. We today tend to think of the priest as the person who celebrates the liturgy each Sunday, and we tend to think of the bishop as a kind of administrator who has charge of the whole diocese. Hippolytus reverses those roles. When he describes the function of the bishop, the essential thing the bishop does is to offer the holy gifts in the liturgy. When he mentions the presbyters, he said it is their task to administer the church. So for him, the bishop is not an administrator, but a celebrant, and the administration is more characteristically the task of the presbyters. That's a very interesting reversal of our normal way of looking at it.
Just a comment about the throne, Father Timothy. This is my understanding. Okay? To understand and to really appreciate the location of the episcopal throne in the nave of the church, you have to imagine the church as they used to be without pews. And that the walls of the church, all of the walls of the church, including in the narthex, were lined with stalls. Okay, have you seen that? Some of you have traveled to the Middle East or Greece or Mount Sinai. Okay, so there were stalls the whole way around the church for everyone. There's one particular stall, for instance, in a monastery that's a little bit fancier. That's the abbot's stall. Or in a convent, it's the abbess's stall for the Mother Superior. It's my understanding that churches of the Byzantine Rite, that when you see a bishop on the throne, that's really an abbatial role rather than an episcopal role. He's acting like the abbot rather than like a bishop. In churches that do not follow the Byzantine or the Greek, let's use that language, the Greek typicon like we do, or the Greek traditions, I mean specifically the Russian church. Father Seraphim, remind me if I'm wrong, but I never saw a Russian bishop stand outside the holy place for Vespers or for Orthros. They were always in the holy place. The only time you saw them was at the end of the service. They would put on the mandia. The doors, the curtain would open. They would bless, who would sing Spalletti. That was the only time you saw a bishop during Vespers or a vigil, Orthros, whatever it happened to be. So that when you see one of our bishops, or the patriarch, on a throne in the nave, he's functioning in an abbatial role. He's doing what an abbot would do in a monastery, or the abbess in a monastery, and not necessarily something that's episcopal. And that's, you notice, how does he vest then? We're speaking of the offices, not the liturgy now. He's vested as an abbot. The mandia is the abbatial mandia. That fancy red thing I wear with the icons and the stripes and everything. That's not episcopal. Well, it is, because it's mine. But if you would go, for instance, if you come to the chancery for the open house on Friday, ask Father Paul's permission if you can go down to his quarters. He has, his apartment down in the basement. He has a picture there of his abbot from St. Paul's Monastery on the Holy Mountain. He looks like a bishop, except he's not wearing an engolpion. He's wearing just the pectoral cross. He has on a fancy mandia like mine. The other monks just wear black, but he wears one that's out of satin and purple or red, whatever, with the icons and the stripes. He's holding the paterizza, which again is not an episcopal staff. The abbots hold that. And if you go to a woman's monastery, the abbess would wear a mandia, just like mine. She would wear a pectoral cross rather than an engolpion, and she would hold the paterizza. I guess in her case it would be a materizza. I don't know. But really what that is, that's the abbot's throne, or the throne of the protos. I didn't want to say abbot. The one of the president of that service, whether it's the bishop, whether it's the abbot, whether it's the abbess. Next to that fancy throne is another stall that looks like every other stall in the church, where if you're in a monastery, all the monks would stand. If you're in a women's monastery, all the nuns would stand. If you're in a parish church that has stalls, all the people would stand. There's another stall next to the bishop's throne that's like everybody else's. And that's where the bishop, or the abbot, or the abbess, or the priest, who's presiding, if there's no abbot or bishop or abbess there, that's where he goes when he stands off to the side. And that's where we would stand for daily services. Like today at Daily Orthros, if we had the big fancy throne, I wouldn't have been in it, or His Grace would not have been in it. He would have been in a normal stall, without mandia. So really, that's abbatial. And the bishop's throne is, as His Grace said, at the high place. That's really the throne that is proper for the bishop. Now, I noticed in the Middle East that many churches have what we call the bishop's throne in the nave. And for our purposes, just to differentiate, many churches have abbatial thrones. cathedral has two, as a matter of fact. Many cathedrals have two, one on each side. One would be for the local bishop, and the other one would be for the emperor if he ever happened to show up. But only cathedral churches, I noticed, in the Middle East have the bishop's throne at the high place. Now, certainly the bishop visits other churches, but the only churches that I noticed that had really the hierarchical throne, that which is proper to him, were cathedral churches. Are they there then?
An interesting fact is that Russian churches prior to 1700 all had the bishop's throne in front and the emperor's throne. And it was after 1700 when the patriarch was no longer in Russia, and it was under the Holy Synod that the throne disappeared from out front. But I also have a question, if I may. Your Grace, if you comment, speaking of the modern priesthood, as to your thoughts of the descent as the sort of the bishop's clergy who got sent out versus the Horepiscopi and that tradition. As to where do we come from as far as clergy, priests who serve alone in churches without a bishop?
The practice of the priest celebrating the liturgy is in fact very ancient. In the letters of St. Ignatius of Antioch, it is said very clearly, let that liturgy be considered valid that is celebrated by the bishop or by somebody whom he has appointed. So already St. Ignatius recognizes that there may be occasions when the bishop is not there to celebrate the liturgy. It might be that the bishop had to go away to another city to attend a synod, and it wouldn't mean that there was no celebration of the liturgy while he was absent. It might be that he was ill, and that would not mean that the Sunday liturgy was suspended. So certainly from the time of St. Ignatius, the idea arose that if the bishop for some reason was not there, then it could be celebrated by a priest. But such a priest would always be acting specifically with the bishop's blessing and in his name. I would see the growth of the practice of presbyters celebrating the liturgy as having its origin there rather than in the existence of chorepiscopi. The whole history of these rural bishops, were they really bishops, is quite obscure. And I'm certainly not an expert in this matter. But to me, it is clear that from a very early date, it was not always possible for the bishop to be the officiant, even in a place where there was no parish system, where the only Eucharistic center was the one center in the city where the bishop officiated. When did the parish system emerge? I suspect it already began in the 3rd century. Already then, with the increase in the number of Christians, there were long periods in the 3rd century when there were no persecutions, and the number of Christians seemed to have grown. Already then, in large cities, it was probably no longer possible for all the people to gather at a single service. But the parish system, as we know it, certainly only really got underway in the 4th century. But I would see this as growing out of the need for there to be sometimes celebrations where the bishop could not be present. Significantly, in Rome, there was the practice of the fermentum. The Pope, when he celebrated as Bishop of the city of Rome, after he had consecrated, deacons would take a small portion of what he had consecrated to the different parish churches. Presumably the Pope's liturgy started rather earlier than the parish liturgies. And in fact, the fermentum, the consecrated element from the Pope's liturgy, was then, I think, placed in the chalice at the celebration in the parishes. That practice came to an end, I'm not sure, those of you who are liturgists will correct me, probably about the 7th or 8th century. But that still shows a survival of the idea that essentially the bishop is the celebrant, and that when priests celebrated in parishes, their liturgy was united with his, and for a time there was even a visible link. I don't think this was ever done in the Christian East, but it shows us how the relation of the parish celebrant to the bishop was understood.
This is the end of this tape.